Good evening. Good evening to everybody. I am Dr. Corrine Johnson, and I would like to welcome you on this evening to our session on tonight. We're going to be talking about the detrimental effects of lack of communication in marriage. So, welcome to each of you. Thank you all so much for tuning in with us on tonight and joining us for this session. For those of you that are coming in, go ahead on and like, tag, and share the video with some other married couples that you know that need to hear this word on tonight. On Friday night, we talked about how blaming causes us to kind of not be able to communicate effectively with one another, as husband and wife, when things are going on in the relationship and one spouse is always blaming the other. And mostly that's because of a lack of communication. And so on tonight, that's what we want to talk about, the detrimental effects of lack of communication in marriage, because a lot of times when we do not communicate in a healthy way in marriage, it causes us to be unhappy a lot of times in our marriages. And a lot of times we think that because some of us have been married for a really long time, we think that a lack of communication is common or normal, when really and truly it's not. And so a lot of times people who have been married for any length of time, especially a long period of time, they get into a rut or a routine, and you just basically just go through the motions, every day, whether we communicate or we don't communicate. We think that, it's normal for you to drift away from one another when it comes to communication, but that is something that we should not be doing in marriage. And so because we get into a rut, sometimes we think that it's okay that if we go an entire day and you all are not communicating with one another, and once again, because you've been married for a long time, you think that this is normal. But though, conversations over time in marriage, they definitely shift. A lot of times, there are different things that, that as we grow, we learn to communicate more. So your communication with your spouse should be shifting. It should be growing. You all should be coming to a place to where you all are able to actually sit down and communicate about whatever problems you're having, without arguing, without yelling, without using all kind of negative body language. Over time, you should be getting to that place to where you could do that. One thing about marriage is when there is no communication, you're not going to be able to have an effective marriage, because marriage is communication. And so without exchanging how you feel, your thoughts and your emotional, if you're not exchanging that with your spouse, then you don't have a healthy marriage. And so you might find that you're not really mindful of making each other a priority. And so when the communication starts to slip, the marriage is heading into a danger zone, because when you all are not able to effectively come together and resolve problems and communicate with one another, your marriage is going to begin to suffer. And so on tonight, I want to give you some reasons that a lack of communication in marriage can be problematic. First of all, when you're not communicating with your spouse, you're not looking to each other for support if there's no communication. And this might not sound like, a big problem, but it really is. Because when you're married, you should be the first person that each of you turns to for support, for help, for respect. But when that element is lacking in your marriage, then what normally takes place is, if you're not careful, you'll end up turning to somebody else for that support and that help and that respect. And we know that that's not going to end up well. So when you're not really talking, or when you feel that you can't talk to one another, then the support goes away and you basically become like roommates. You know, you just living up under the same roof. You're really not talking to one another. You're not sharing your feelings. You're not sharing your emotions. You're basically just roommates. And so how do you know if you're not being a support to your partner? Well, first of all, you dismiss their concerns. You don't care about their feelings. You don't care about their day. You don't care about anything that's concerning them. You don't offer any help, when they're making decisions. You criticize them often and sometimes unnecessarily. You don't motivate them to achieve their dreams and aspirations. Those are some of the ways that you can tell that you're not being a supportive spouse. And so when there is no communication in a marriage between spouses, except for things pertaining to your routines, understand there is inadequate support in your relationship. So remember that you should always lift each other up and talk to each other. And so the two of you can begin to keep that close knitness together. When you focus on good communication, then the support for each other comes a little bit more naturally. So when you make everything that I just said, when you make it a priority, you're going to end up with a healthier marriage where you can communicate effectively with your spouse. The next thing the next reason that a lack of communication in marriage can be problematic is because you may feel like you're living with a stranger. And when you're not communicating with your spouse, you all are drifting further and further apart. And so it's going to seem like you are living with a stranger because y'all are going to drift apart. And so what we must understand that if you've had a couple of days or even weeks where you're not really talking, it can feel like you are literally living with a stranger in your own home. And though you may not mean for it to happen, lack of communication in a marriage can make you feel like you have really lost each other. So if you don't keep the communication going, then you feel like you lose, that friendship, that relationship. You feel like you lose each other. And so if this continues over time, then the intimacy is going to eventually suffer as well. Because when it comes down to being intimate with your spouse, even when it comes down to sex, the intimacy starts before you get into the bedroom. So if you all can't even communicate together, then it's going to affect the intimacy over time as well. The connection is going to be weakened and you're going to find it hard to find common ground. And so lack of communication in marriage leads to divorce. And sometimes when there is nothing left to share or to talk about between the two partners, once again, that huge separation takes place to the point to where you feel like y'all just roommates and strangers living up under the same roof, but you're not talking to one another. So a lack of marriage communication is going to eventually, over time, if you don't get some help from a counselor or your pastor or whoever, it's going to lead to divorce. And so I'm going to give you some signs on tonight that indicate that you and your spouse have become strangers. Your spouse is not able to read between the lines. They are unable to decipher your emotions. Your sex life dwindles away. On top of that, other forms of physical connection like hugging and kissing, it becomes scarce. You don't even do that anymore. You have not dressed up or gone out on date nights in a long time. Your communication is limited to discussing chores and finances, and that's it. That's how you know, that's one of the signs that indicate to you that you and your partner have literally become strangers. And so you may find out that you argue more and you spend less and less time with one another. And so, though lack of communication or no communication on some days may not be a problem, if this continues over time, then you're going to have an undesirable situation and you're going to really crave for that connection. So, beware of this and don't let conversations be on hold too long if you want to stay connected and stay in love. Because most of the time, when there is conflict in marriage, we like to, shove stuff to the side. We don't want to deal with it. We don't want to talk about it right at that particular time. And so we'll kind of shove it to the side, be like, okay, we'll deal with that later. Well, you can deal with it later, and then you can deal with the next thing later and the next thing later. But the only thing it's doing is stacking up. And over time, if you don't deal with it, then you're going to find yourself in a place to where one day you're going to be talking to your spouse and they just going to erupt and explode because there's so much that you've allowed to stack up that you have not resolved because you all are not communicating. You all are not talking to one another. You all are not resolving any conflict. And so we have to understand that when there is no connection, when you and your spouse are not communicating, that's one of the ways that you can know that you're drifting further and further apart. The next reason that a lack of communication in marriage can really be problematic is that this can rob you of your connection over time. When there is no communication in your marriage, it's just not a good thing, because your spouse is supposed to be your best friend. Your spouse is supposed to be the person that you can go to, that you can talk to about anything, any and everything. And so when there is no communication that's taking place, it's going to be problematic because, you're not talking to one another. You're not communicating as you should. So due to a lack of communication in your relationship, you're going to lose that connection that you all once had. You're going to lose the love. You're going to lose the passion. You're going to lose that spark that you all once shared because there is no communication. So poor communication in marriage can make people be tempted to cheat. Yes, I said it. Poor communication in marriage make people or spouses tempted to cheat because it can make you feel like being married isn't quite what it used to be anymore. And so a lot of times when you start feeling like your marriage ain't what it used to be anymore, and you all are not able to communicate and sit down and share these emotions and share these feelings and tell one another how you're feeling, you're going to be tempted to cheat. Because where your spouse, the area where your spouse is lacking, you're going to be looking for that in somebody else. That's how most affairs begin. And most affairs begin in the workplace. Because let's say, for an example, if a relationship is struggling, you and your husband don't have no communication going on. Y'all not talking to one another. You're just existing. It's like you're just roommates in your home. Okay, well, when that begins to take place, there's no intimacy taking place. And 9 times out of 10, ain't no sex taking place either. Y'all get into bed at night, turning your backs to one another and forget it. We ain't that, we've drifted so far apart now, it don't even matter. And so now, let's say, for instance, that when that wife goes to work, and then here it is, this little handsome man. The enemy knows how to set it up. And if you're not strong enough, you'll fall for it. So here's this handsome young man, see you sitting in the break room and you looking sad. And so he asks you, well, what's going on? What's the problem? And then you start sharing with the opposite sex what your husband is not doing and what you wish your husband would do. And you just opened up the door for the enemy to come in and tempt you to cheat on your husband. Because see, what happens is we get so focused in on the 20% that we're not getting at home. And so then even though your husband, may be a good man, he may be a faithful husband, he may be one that's providing for you, but you all have drifted apart and you all are not connected anymore. And so now you got this handsome young man at work that's promising you the 20%. Oh, I'll talk to you. I'll communicate with you. I don't understand. You seem like such a sweet young lady. Why can't he talk to you? Let's meet and have lunch, and then we can talk some more and I can listen. He'll provide that 20% and lure you away from your relationship. Because you got to understand that when your relationship is going through a tough time, you got to be aware, you got to be alert, you got to make sure that you, even though the relationship may be going through a hard time and you all not communicating, you should not be telling the opposite sex anything about anything that's going on in your home, because you're opening up the door for the enemy to begin to come in and destroy your marriage. So effects of a lack of communication in marriage can be devastating to your relationship. So it is important to identify and rectify all of your communication problems in marriage before things fall apart between you and your spouse. So how do you fix communication in a relationship? Because no communication in a relationship, if there's no communication, eventually, it's gonna end in a way that you really don't want it to end, or if that continues over time. So looking for definitive answers to the questions, how to fix lack of communication in relationship, or how to improve communication with your spouse. Well, the first thing that you can do to fix communication issues in your marriage is to take out 15 minutes every day to talk about your day with your spouse. And we touched on this a little bit on the video from Friday. Take 15 minutes out of every day and make sure that you talk to your spouse about their day. Marriage and communication are intertwined for relationship satisfaction. So you gotta communicate. You gotta communicate what's going on. You gotta share your feelings. You gotta share your thoughts. You have to communicate. Communication between couples fosters the love bond. So while poor communication in marriage festers resentment and distance between you and your spouse. So one of the best communication tips for couples is to pay close attention to your partner's body language. And it's going to help you understand your partner's mood, and it's going to enhance marital communication. Marriage without communication is rendered fragile and vulnerable to a host of other relationship problems. So you got to listen to your partner attentively when they speak. When you all are communicating with one another, pay attention to their body language, because body language says a whole lot as well. And so this will encourage you all to have such a conversation, that's going to literally start sparking you all to kind of share your emotions, share your feelings with one another, because you got to prevent the breakdown in the marriage. And when there is no communication, there's going to be a breakdown in your marriage, whether you want it to happen or not. And so the next thing that you can do to fix your communication issues is I gave you an activity to do as well on Friday that goes along with the 15 minutes that I just talked about. You and your spouse sit down every day, take 15 minutes out of your day. My husband and I, we basically talk at the dinner table, but then we also take time, when we go to bed at night, when we get into bed, we also take that time as well to kind of talk to one another, laugh with one another, and just kind of share our day and talk about how our day went. And we talk about other things as well, but we constantly keep the communication lines open. And that's what you got to do. You got to make sure that you sacrifice, even if it's 15 minutes. And if it can be more, let it be more. But start off with 15 minutes a day and make sure that you all have that 15 minutes of undisturbed time talking to one another, sharing your day. If there's something going on in the household that's getting on your nerves or that's frustrating you, share that. That's the time that you talk and be open and be vulnerable and share what it is that you are feeling. Because when you're not able to communicate, that lack of communication in a relationship is gonna be problematic. So you want to make sure that every single day, once again, that you all are setting aside that 15 minutes and you all are communicating and you're talking to one another, because you don't want to be that couple that say, oh, we've been married for 20 years, we don't need to communicate, it's okay, if we don't talk for a couple of days. No, you need to be communicating every day. Because if you're not communicating every day, then what's going to take place is you're going to begin to drift further and further and further away from your spouse. And what's going to begin to happen is it's going to be a disconnect that's going to take place. And when that disconnect takes place and it begins to happen over a period of time, you're opening up the door for the enemy to come in so many ways and cause you all for the marriage to just be very problematic. And so you want to make sure that you're communicating. And when you are communicating with one another, stop yelling at one another. No matter how heated the conversation is, learn how to manage your voice tone. You can get your point across without yelling. You can get your point across without rolling your eyes. You can get your point across without, all of this negative body language and vibes. Learn how to communicate and also learn how to control your voice tone as you talk. And so on tonight, I just came on to give you some of the detrimental effects of a lack of communication in marriage. And we're going to come back on tomorrow night, and I'm going to give you some ways that you can go from conflict to communication in your marriage, because we don't want to have to always every day be going through some form of conflict in our marriage to where we're disagreeing every single day. That should not be. And so on tomorrow night, I'm going to give you some tools and some strategy to go from conflict to communication, so you'll be able to effectively communicate with your spouse. So once again, thank you all so much for tuning in and joining with me on tonight for the detrimental effects of lack of communication in marriage. And it is my prayer that you all will tune in for part 2 on tomorrow night. And for when we get ready to end this video, I want you all to encourage your husbands to tune in at 8 o'clock. My husband will be back on with Ephesians 5, daily devotion for men, for the husbands. And so encourage your husbands to tune in, because he's been really digging deep and doing some really good teaching on the Ephesians 5 for the husbands. So tell your husbands to tune in at 8 o'clock, and my husband will have a word for them to position them to be the husbands that God has called them to be. So God bless you. Thank you so much for tuning in on tonight. Remember to like, tag, and share this video with some other married couples that that need to understand the detrimental effects of a lack of communication in their marriage. God bless you and have a great evening.